Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture by Timothy Snyder, who actually needs no introduction, but I would be really not playing my role as a host properly if I were to fail to say a few words about him. Before I do that, and before Tim's own lecture on Ukrainian history as world history, 1917 and 2027, I just want to give you 3 pieces of information about the framework of this evening's talk, and so that you know that there is a program of which this lecture is a part, and that after Tim's lecture there are some other things, goodies in the house that we would like to welcome you to. The lecture opens the conference Revolutionary Ukraine, a reflection on 1917 and its aftermath, organized by the Austrian Ukrainian Historians Commission, whose members I would like to welcome here with us. I think it's your second meeting here with us, and a very warm welcome to all of you. And it's organized under the auspices of the Ukraine in European Dialogue program at the IWM, which Tim has initiated here 2 years ago. Many of you have traveled a long distance to take part in the conference, and we're very pleased to host you here. The conference is accompanied by a cultural program on Ukrainian avant-garde films entitled Filming the Revolution. It's curated by Konstantin Akinsha, whom I would also like to thank for this. The work put into the curation of the cultural program, because it consists not only of the film retrospective, and you are cordially invited to see the films as well, I'll say a word about it in a moment, but also of an art exhibition, and this exhibition is housed at the moment at the IWM. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all 3 protagonists of this program: Dr. Akinsha, who is an art historian, journalist, and curator, as well as the founding director and chair of the Russian Avant-Garde Research Project in the UK; Ivan Kozlenko, an expert in film and cultural studies and director of the Ukrainian National Cinematic Center in Kyiv; and Claudia Slanar, also an art historian and a writer, who is the curator of the Blickel Keynote. After Tim Snyder's lecture this evening, I will request Konstantin Akinsha to give a very brief introduction to the in-house exhibition on Ukrainian avant-garde film posters, which are here at the Institute on display. I was told something which I didn't understand quite at the last moment on the staircase, but if I understood right, for those of you who are not great fans of going up and down the staircase, many times there is a possibility to view the posters in the room next door. What that possibility exactly is, technically, I didn't quite understand, but I know that there is a possibility. So you have an easy way of viewing the posters, and you have a more arduous way if you decide to take our staircase. I would also like to welcome here, very special warm welcome to you, Maria Prishlak, rector of the Ukrainian Free University in Munich, who is our cooperation partner since 2 years, since we established the Ukraine program at the Institute. The second part, as I said, of the program, Filming the Revolution, takes place at the Blickel Keynote at 21er Haus. It's on Sunday, 15th October, and also on coming Wednesday, October 18th, with screenings of Ukrainian avant-garde films from the 1920s, as well as, of course, conversations with the 3 protagonists whom I've just mentioned. So I would like to extend you a warm welcome to visit the film evenings, the screenings as well. Very quickly, a really, really warm welcome to Tim Snyder again, and we hope we're going to see much more of him and of Marcy next year. because they're going to be coming back to the IWM. As most of you know, he is a permanent fellow of the Institute. Many of his most important books in the recent years have been partly written at the Institute, and we have had occasion to present many of these books here as well. He's not only among the leading American historians of Europe, but he's also a well-known public intellectual, well-known for his groundbreaking work on the history of Central and Eastern Europe, and especially on the Holocaust and totalitarianisms in Europe. But more recently, his interest has shifted to questions of contemporary politics. Many of you may have seen his last book on tyranny, and the new book, he tells me, is also about the decline of the West, but he doesn't want to call it the West, so I'm not going to give you the title because it's a secret, but that'll be the next talk we will feature here by Tim. He teaches history at Yale, where he has the Bud White Husum Professorship of History. In 2017, that is this year, he won the Guggenheim Fellowship, a very, very prestigious fellowship in the US, in the course of which he will work on another new book project, this time titled Brotherlands. And for those of you who know Bloodlands, you will realize that there's a resonance here. But Brotherlands is a family history of the modern nation. The landmark book, 2010, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, as I just mentioned briefly, I'm very, very proud, was written partly at the IWM. Black Earth, The Holocaust as History and Warning, published in 2015 as well. And as I said, his last book on tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, has already been translated within the year into 35 languages and received as much critical acclaim as both Bloodlands and Black Earth. So Tim, welcome back, and we hope to see you for much, much longer next year. So we're not going to let you fly in and out so quickly.
Okay, thank you very much. Is the microphone on? Is it all me? Okay. Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to visit my home. It's nice to visit. It's nice to have a home. It's even nicer to visit your home, which is something that the UVM allows me to do. It's such a pleasure to be here with you in this library where you don't know. I don't know either. Yeah.
I think it's on. No.
Okay. So you should feel free to, yeah, you have a great shrug. My motor neurons are making me shrug with you. You're welcome to come up here and try to fix it if you want.
I can't tell what's doing this.
It was on in between.
Yeah, I can't tell what's doing it.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk loud. So it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Shalini. Thank you to all of you for allowing me to do this. Thank you in particular to Ukrainian and Austrian colleagues who are beginning this important work in the Austrian-Ukrainian Historical Commission, which of course, were we in Kiev, would be the Ukrainian-Austrian Historical Commission. One of the nice things about these commissions is you have to learn to be a diplomat. I want to thank in particular Wolfgang Muller for taking up the Austrian side of this work. For those of you who do not know him, Wolfgang Muller is a leading historian of Austrian and Russian history. I was once reading a long book by Wolfgang Muller in my parents' house outside in the hot tub. And my brother, who was German speaking, walked out of the house, gave me one look and said, "Aber du darfst nicht den Wolfgang Muller im Jacuzzi lesen." And that is precisely the kind of historian that Wolfgang Muller is. He's not the kind of historian that you should be reading in the hot tub. He's a leading historian who we're very happy to have. And thank you, Wolfgang, for joining this initiative, which is a small part of what Kate Younger and Tanya Georgienko have been doing here in the IWM within the framework of our Ukraine in European Dialogue program, of which I'm very happy to be a part. My little role in this weekend's events is to give you a brief talk about Ukrainian history as global history, with general reference to the revolution of 1917 and with general reference to the present day. The claim that I'd like to make is that global history makes much more sense with Ukrainian history inside it. What I have found in my own work is that Ukrainian history is a kind of gift to global history, that Ukrainian history in many ways is a missing link that makes certain trends in global history make more sense. Let me start with the revolution of 1917. There's a wonderful quote about the revolution, the French Revolution, from Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese revolutionary, when asked whether the French Revolution had been a good thing or a bad thing. Chiang Kai-shek said almost 200 years afterwards, "It's too soon to say," right? Now, like almost every famous quotation in history, that one is probably false. Just so you know, like the percentage of epigraphs in books, which no one actually ever said, is very high. Chiang Kai-shek actually never said that it's too soon to say, but nevertheless, that falsehood contains an important truth. The history of revolutions comes around and around and around and around again. What I'd like to do with 1917 this evening is consider the way it thought about history with the way that we think about history. What I'd like to do is begin with what the revolutionaries of 1917 thought they were doing with history, and then end by trying to make sense of the century in a way which is different from how they would have made sense with it, although it has some commonalities. So what did the revolutionaries of 1917 think about history? What did they think they were doing with history? So this is one of the ways that the revolution of 1917 is alien to us, because we are in a culture of nostalgia and commemoration. Right? We are in a culture of superstitious reverence for years of round numbers. We are in a culture where anniversaries are so important, they actually affect the real world. And if you don't believe this, consider the war in Ukraine in 2014. The way that the West reacted to the war in Ukraine in 2014 was materially affected by the fact that it was the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War. And hence the metaphorical force of the beginning of the First World War was applied to how we reacted to 1914. We said, let us be cautious. Let us make sure we know what is happening. Let us not hasten to act. Let us not be the first to fire the guns of August, and so on. If the war in Ukraine had been the anniversary of Munich, presumably we would have reacted in an entirely different way. Because we have this, because our culture has become such a culture of commemoration. Memory has displaced history to such an extent. I would go so far as to say the superstition, the pagan superstition of round numbers, has replaced historical enlightenment to such an extent that it actually affects the choices that we make in the real world. So I just say that by way of introducing the point I want to make, which is that in 1917, the revolutionaries were not saying, what does 1817 mean for us? In 1917, the revolutionaries, the Bolshevik revolutionaries, were thinking about history as something that moved forward according to certain rules, which were understandable, and which they perhaps understood better than others, and which perhaps they understood well enough to move history along further. That history was known, it had laws, they were its scientists, and perhaps also its technicians, in the sense of being able to turn those gears a little bit faster than they would have otherwise. If that's true, where does Ukraine fit into a history seen in that way? These are subjects which my colleagues will talk about in greater length, of course. I'll just talk about them very briefly. But if you think about history that way, Ukraine becomes central to the making of a Soviet state. After the revolution of 1917, the civil wars, in plural, fought on the territory of the old Russian Empire were fought centrally in Ukraine, whether it's the Red-White Civil War or whether it's wars involving Ukrainian armies, again in the plural, whether it's the war involving Poland, centrally fought in Ukraine. If you're a Soviet state builder, Ukraine is the major national let's call it problem, which you are confronting in the 1920s. If you are Stalin and you're completing the political revolution in 1927 with the economic and social revolution of 1928 with the first five-year plan, Ukraine is also a critical, if not the critical place of revolution. It is where collectivization will fail or where it will succeed. This is how one thinks about Ukraine if one thinks about history as something which moves forward and is being accelerated. What might we say today? I want to suggest a different view. I want to suggest a view which is neither history as commemoration, which I think it's not, nor history as acceleration or technique, which I also think it's not. What I want to try to do today is suggest more gently a way that Ukraine in 1917 or Ukraine today, Ukraine in the last century, helps us to make sense of modern history or global history as we see it. And the suggestion that I'm going to try to make is that Ukraine is not exceptional. I mean, this is, sorry, I'm just picking out Ukrainians in the crowd now. I don't have to pick them out because I could just look to see how they reacted to that sentence. It's not that I knew them personally, it's that I could tell. Not that Ukraine is, and then there are the Ukrainian cosmopolitans who are like, oh, whatever, right? Like Boris, like, yeah, of course, I'm fine. That Ukraine is, the point, the way I want to press this argument is by saying that Ukraine is hypertypical. That Ukraine is so typical of major trends that it gets buried by or buried in these trends. And that if we can pull it up and see it for what it was, then these trends begin to make more sense. So the claim is that Ukraine is hypertypical of three basic moments in the last 100 years or so of history. And those moments, and I'll go through them in order, but those moments are first, the encounter of nation with empire. Second, the creation of what? The creation, stop it with the shrugging, it's very distracting. The creation, so when something goes wrong, you just have to smile calmly, like nothing's wrong. Yeah, like when you get married, it's really good. Like no matter what happens, just smile, like it's all good. It's just great. Okay, so I've just changed your life. So the first is nation and empire. The second is the creation of what I'm going to call neo-empires or new empires in Europe in the 1930s and 1940s, European imperialism in Europe itself. And the third moment is the encounter of the European Union with states. I'm going to take those as being three moments. So nations and empires, new empires in Europe, and the European Union and states. And again, my idea here is that Ukraine is so typical of these moments that if we look carefully at Ukraine, then we see the moments, and then the whole history starts to fall into place. Okay, so first example, nations and empires. Now, the first move that I need to make here, or the first claim that I want to suggest to help it all make sense, is that we have to bring the two ways that we see, the two different ways that we see imperial history together. The first way that we see imperial history is that we see it as Europe and everybody else, right? So if I say global history, most people would think, okay, that's Europe, as it were, against everyone else. That's colonialism coming out from Europe, and then anti-colonialism coming back into Europe from Africa or from Asia or from Latin America. That's one way to think about empire and nation, the global way. And then there's another way, which is seemingly completely different, which is the national way, where you're Polish or Ukrainian or you're Serbian, and you think, well, nation and empire means my nation, one nation, and a local empire, right? And unconsciously, we use nation and empire in both of those ways, in a global way and in a local way. And we unconsciously, I think, separate those out into two completely different histories. And what I want to try to suggest in this lecture in various ways is that that's actually one history, and that Ukraine is the place which can help us to see it as one history. Okay, so let me begin to try to make that case. Let me begin by talking about the revolution of 1917. So the Bolshevik Revolution presents itself as anti-colonial. And of course, the Soviet Union presents itself as anti-colonial. In what sense, in what material sense was the Bolshevik Revolution anti-colonial? In what way did the Bolshevik Revolution actually bring down empires in its own time. I'm going to make a suggestion that it does so in a very straightforward and almost banal way, which we can overlook. And that is that before we even think about how the Soviets worked against the British in India, or how they worked against the Poles in Western Ukraine, before we even get to that, we have to think of the moment of 1917 itself as a moment when land empires fell apart. That the revolution, so I'm not thinking about it in their terms, I'm thinking about it in mine. That in 1917 is the beginning of a moment, 1917 to 1918, when the land empires of Europe fall apart. That the Russian Empire is, of course, the land empire par excellence. Muscovy, started in 1410, moved south through some of Europe in Asia, then moves eastern to the Pacific Ocean, then and finally moves west. Kiev, Treaty of Andrusovo, partitions of Poland in the end of the 18th century, Catherine the Great a bit before that, down to the Black Sea. That this is the world land empire. It's the biggest land empire in the history of the world. It's the land empire par excellence. When that empire falls, whatever the Bolsheviks say about it, right, that's the beginning of a trend. Because what happens after that, when the revolution begins, the Habsburgs and the Germans, I'm going to now do this tricky chronology thing that historians sometimes do, okay? So after the Bolshevik Revolution, November 1917, the Habsburgs and the Germans rush in, right, to fill the void. They jointly occupy Ukraine. They have big ideas, especially the Germans, about how they're going to apply the notion of self-determination to Eastern Europe to create a bunch of client states in what's now the Baltics, Belarus, and Ukraine. They come rushing in early 1918. They sign treaties at Brest-Litovsk to formalize this state of affairs. They send in people, Skoropadsky and in the nice Habsburg case, Vasil Vyshivany, lest we forget. They have their own ideas of how to rule Ukraine, which are of course different, getting better, which are different. The camera is going to wonder like who I'm talking to this whole time, right? The different ideas of how to rule Ukraine. So for example, I once spent a couple of days reading the German and the Austrian diplomatic traffic coming from Ukraine in early 1918. And the Austrians had come up with this very characteristic idea that they were going to find all the Ukrainian officers and give them bright, fresh, clean, very stylish new uniforms. And so the German diplomats were reporting back to Berlin on this, and one of my favorite sentences ever in German diplomatic history is the last sentence of one of these telegraphs, and it says, "Why don't we ever think of things like that?" Which so beautifully like distinguished the Austrian, the German policies like then and forever. So this is early 1918, but while this is playing out so nicely in early 1918 in Ukraine, a bad thing is happening from the point of view of the Habsburgs and the Germans in France, which is that hundreds of thousands of American soldiers are arriving in France, and the war is going to be fought, won and lost, not in Eastern Europe, but in France and Western Europe. The Americans, for every German soldier who dies, there's a period of weeks where for every German soldier who dies, he's not replaced by a German soldier, but by an American soldier, right? The German soldiers are dying by the tens of thousands, and the Americans are arriving at almost exactly the same rate. So the Germans lose the war on the Western front, which means that the end of the Russian Empire is followed very closely by the end of the German Empire, right? It was a Reich. It's followed very closely by the end of the Habsburg Empire, and of course the end of the Ottoman Empire as well. So the way that this is an anti-imperial moment is different from the way the Bolsheviks present it. What they do is they set off a cascade of events which leads to the end of territorial empires in Europe as such. And this distinction now I want to make. For me, this is the great accident of European history. Like history, one thing that history is about accidents and noticing that they're accidents and accepting that they're accidents. So if you write novels, they're never accidents, right? If you're Chekhov and there's a gun in the drawer, it's because you put the gun in the drawer. That's not an accident. That doesn't count as an accident. If you're a social scientist, there are no accidents, right? There's only data. And if it doesn't fit your model, you just like push it completely off the scene, completely. Social scientists smile, some of them boo. But if you're a historian, you say, yes, there are contingent facts, there are accidents. And I think for me, the most important contingent fact or accident of European history in the 20th century is this: the land empires go first. The land empires go after the First World War. The maritime empires go after the Second World War. And that is a coincidence. It didn't have to be that way. It just was, right? So in the First World War, the Americans, by that point a maritime empire, the Americans come in, rescue the British and the French. And so the British, the greatest maritime empire in the history of the world, they survive. The French, also a big maritime empire, they survive. The Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch maritime empires all survive, right? The empires that go are the land empires. Why is this so important? It's so important because it means that we're now going to see an experiment with a nation state in Europe, okay? And here's the first place where I want to say Ukraine is hypertypical. If you look at the West Ukrainian National Republic, if you look at the Ukrainian National Republic, you just see a blip, right? A very brief moment of political activity between, let's say 1918 and 1922, and then it's over before you know it. And if you're a Ukrainian, this can seem like a tragic moment. If you're a historian of the nation state, you can look at this in a different way. You can say that is actually typical, because all of these attempts at forming nation states after 19 failed fast. They all failed fast, right? None of them lasted for more than 2 decades. And I mean, from the point of view, I'm just going to say from the point of view of like a whole era, the difference between lasting for a year and lasting for 20 years is not that great. So that Ukraine as a state doesn't last for very long is also true of Austria, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. It's true of all of the new states that are formed after the First World War. They're all done by 1940 at the latest. It's also true, by the way, of many of the nation states that had come to be into the 19th century. They're not going to last until the Second World War. The experiment with a nation state is not going to work out. Now, I'm just going to take a step back and dwell on that for a moment, because it's a very important point. The point is that Ukraine as a nation state that doesn't work is hypertypical, right? It's not an exception. It's actually the rule performed at its logical extreme. So let me just take a step back and consider the logic of this a bit longer. Let me just take a step back to the 19th century for a moment and consider the nation state as such. So when I say nation state, okay, this is like a call and response rap. So when I say nation state, you say France. You don't have to actually say France. But when I say nation state, you say France. We've all been trained to say France. When we say, I mean, there are other things, like if I say éclair, if I say love, you'll say France. We have all these associations with France, none of which are true except éclair. I'll give them that. I'll give them a lot of pastries. But the nation state, they have nothing to do with. France was never a nation state. I mean, it's fun to say État-nation, right? And then you say, isn't it interesting how the French say state-nation instead of nation-state? And then you say again, État-nation, right? But they've never been a nation state. Before 1789, they were an empire, and after 1789, they were an empire with slightly different regimes in the middle of the empire. They haven't been a nation state. They made that up. It never happened. This is typical, by the way. No, it didn't, right? They were never a nation state. This is typical. All the West Europeans have this issue, basically. Like they teach their children that they were nation states, which is a total fable. It didn't happen ever. Never happened. In the East Europeans, at least it happened for a few weeks, like in Ukraine. But for the West Europeans, it never happened at all, which makes it a fable. Okay, so if you want to look for the nation state happens where? It happens in the Balkans. Greece, Serbia. Those are nation states. Romania, 1878. Bulgaria, 1908. These are nation states. That is where the nation state comes from. It comes from the anti-colonial, notice the word, the anti-colonial movements of the Balkans against the Ottoman Empire in the first part of the 19th century. Which anti-colonial movements lead to, I got a watch, I should use it. Which anti-colonial movements lead to a challenged empire, right? So nation states can challenge empires. They can even bring them down. But what they can't do is provide an automatic replacement to them. So if we look at the logic of the nation state, this is kind of making me. If you look at the logic of the nation state in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe, you see an overall pattern, which is this. These nation states that are first formed, Greece, Serbia. Serbian history is actually, I mean, in my view, the key to all of this. Greece, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, Montenegro, you name it, Macedonia, Albania. The pattern is the nation states are not sufficient unto themselves. The nation states create huge armies, they fight wars for more territory. And in the early 20th century, what they managed to do is actually bring down not one, but two empires. The First Balkan War of 1912 is these new nation states proving themselves to be fully sovereign by driving the Ottoman Empire out of Europe, which is a world historical event, right? Empires are not supposed to lose wars to these small nation states. When I say nation state, you think sovereign, but that's not what the powers thought. The powers thought these new nation states are just our clients. It's just imperialism with a different label, basically. When the nation states of the Balkans fought a war and drove the Ottoman Empire out of Europe, they were proving themselves to be sovereign. They were proving that they could do things on their own. Similarly, and more disastrously, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and the beginning of the First World War is an exercise in Balkan sovereignty. Right? So the First World War is actually the Third Balkan War, and it follows the logic of creating the nation state. So nation states can create problems for empires. What they can't do is solve those problems. Hence the irony of the outcome of the First World War. So the First World War is started by nation states, Serbia. Admittedly, a lot happens in the intervening 4 years. But puzzlingly, it's still a bit of a puzzle that at the end of the First World War, Serbia is a victor. Its war aims are fulfilled. And not only that, Serbia's political philosophy spreads across much of Europe. So the nation state, which forms in the Balkans against the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, is then extended after 1918 to much of Eastern Europe. So new states are created. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Austria, it's a new nation state, all of which, as I say, are going to fail disastrously very soon. And what's typical of all this, and this is the point that I'm trying to make, is that without a system, these nation states don't have a chance. Now, if you look at it from the point of view of Czech history or Ukrainian history or Macedonian history or whatever, it all seems like an individual tragedy. The Poles are the best about this, right? I mean, the Poles are the best at presenting what happened in the 20s and 30s as being a very specific tragedy to which no one else's tragedy could possibly be compared. And the way they do it is by not studying the period. But that's the magic of national history. The magic of national history is that your collapse looks unlike everybody else's collapse. But in fact, these nation states were basically doomed by the lack of a higher European level of politics in the 1920s and 1930s, right? That's what they have. That's what they have in common. And what I'm trying to say is that Ukraine here is very typical. Ukraine is not really unlike these other places in the 19th century. It too has its grand romantic poet, right, Shevchenko. It too has its populist historian who is probably better in another language, but nevertheless manages to write the whole national history as a social history in an impossible labor, right? They all have that. Ukraine has that too. It too has the songs, right? It too has the story about how we've been divided among empires, which, by the way, is a good thing. If you want to have, the Poles do this too. They say we were divided in three. That's terrible. If you want to have a national movement, partition is a good thing. No, it is. Not being partitioned retards a national movement. That's not what they teach you in school, I know, but it's actually the case. Think about why is the Russian national movement still in 2017 entangled with the imperial idea? Why is the Belarusian national idea so weak? This is why. Having Galicia separated from the rest of Ukraine is an advantage, not a disadvantage, because it means that in the 1860s and 1870s, when Ukrainian politics becomes hard in the Russian Empire, you can then go to Lviv, Lemberg. In Poland, it's the same story. When things get hot in the Russian Empire, you go to Poznan and you write some books. And when things get bad there, you go to Krakow and you drink some coffee. And then you just repeat the whole thing, right? That was Józef Pilsudski's biography, by the way, that I just gave you. So being partitioned is actually typical. It's actually a favorable condition. It's not some kind of unique tragedy. So up until 1918, Ukraine is actually typical. And then when it doesn't get a nation state, what I'm trying to say is that's also not exceptional. That's hypertypical. When we move into the next moment, we see how Ukraine is typical in a different and in a more tragic moment, which is the moment of neo-empire. I'll spend less time on this because the argument will be familiar to those of you who have read Bloodlands or Black Earth. But the argument is that in the 1930s and 1940s, what both the Nazis and the Soviets tried to do can only be understood if you see how they are looking at world empire. We can say, well, we're just going to look at German sources or whatever, holding myself back. Or we can say, we're just going to look at Russian sources. And this is something that Kotkin has right. The way that they see the world is by way of world history. So Hitler is not saying, I'm going to build a German nation or anything like that. What Hitler is saying is that we don't seem to be able to build a maritime empire around the world. This is in Mein Kampf. The only thing that is left for us to do is to conquer Eurasia, right? Stalin is not saying socialism in one country because I like the one country. Stalin is saying, this is 1928, the time of the beginning of the first five-year plan, Stalin is saying we need a policy, I'm quoting now, of internal colonization. I'm quoting still, because unlike the great colonial powers, we don't have maritime territories to exploit, right? That is the logic of the first five-year plan in a nutshell. If you don't have a far-flung colonial empire, you colonize yourself. You colonize yourself. So the ideologies are very different, and the goal of colonization was very different. But where these two neo-imperial powers focus their energy overlaps. Overlaps where? It overlaps in Ukraine. In the first five-year plan, which of course affects the entire Soviet Union and is painful all over the Soviet Union. But in the first five-year plan, 1928 to 1933, one of the major goals is the control of Ukrainian black earth and Ukrainian grain stocks. And because that is central, dekulakization in Ukraine is particularly harsh, requisitions targets are particularly high, and when collectivization doesn't work out very well, Stalin moves in the second half of 1932 to a political account of why this is failing. This is an argument first made by Terry Martin. And that political explanation of the failure of grain requisitions leads to a much greater famine in the boundaries of Soviet Ukraine than would have happened otherwise, somewhere between 3 and 4 million deaths. When Hitler is thinking about building a German empire, he is also thinking predominantly of Ukraine, controlling the black earth of Ukraine. His idea, in this respect, he is like Stalin, is that the only way to rival the British, who are the world superpower at the time, the only way to rival the British is for us, the Germans, to be autarkic, to be self-sufficient. The only way to do that is to control enough rich territory, by which we mean, above all things, Ukraine. And so, again, the idea of how this is going to be done is different, although there are certain interesting overlaps, because Hitler is aware, for example, and his planners are aware of the collective farms. So the idea is that they're going to use the collective farms in order to extract even more grain. That doesn't work, by the way, because the Germans just have an occupation apparatus. They don't have the party. It's one of many places where our stereotype of German efficiency completely breaks down. The Stalinist apparatus was much better, incomparably better at extracting grain from Ukraine than the German apparatus was. At the end of the day, the Germans get less grain from Ukraine than they get from Belgium in the Second World War, which is a sign of how things don't work. But they do succeed in starving people, not as many as they planned. They planned to starve dozens of millions of Soviet citizens in this winter of 1941 alone. They don't starve that many, but they do starve people. They starve almost 1 million people in Leningrad during the siege. They starve tens of thousands of people in Kharkiv and Kiev. And above all, they starve or kill as a result of malnutrition around 3 million Soviet prisoners of war. So there is the point here is that you have this encounter of what I'm calling new empires. And the result in Ukraine is particularly deadly. Roughly 3 to 4 million people starved in 1932-33. Another 3 million Ukrainian inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine killed by German occupation, of whom more than half were Jews. Another 3 million or so inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine die as Red Army soldiers. So there is no event of this scale in any other country in the world. And the reason that we have it, the reason that we see it or can see it, the way that we can see this whole phenomenon of the neo-empire or the double neo-empire is to look at it from the point of view of Ukraine. If you look at it from Berlin or from Moscow, you don't see it. Now, it's a terrible, terrible price, right? And it just suggests to me that we should at least try to understand. Okay, third point, which is Europe and the state. So the first historical moment was the nation and the empire. And my point was Ukrainian failure to establish a nation state is actually typical and revealing. Second point was the new empires, Europeans colonizing Europeans. And my point was, from the perspective of Ukraine, the aspirations and the consequences of neo-imperial policy comes clearest. My third moment is Europe, or the European Union, and the states. Okay, so here again I'm going to repeat a very important tendon, a very important connection in this argument, which is that we have to be able to connect empire in the sense of Europeans and the world with Europe itself. Because the whole deception in contemporary European history is to break that, right? The way that Europeans tell history, West Europeans mostly, tell themselves history is to break off the imperial history and to tell themselves a story of national history, which means that no one understands, I think, some of the most important things. Okay, let me now try to make this connection. Let me make it by way of, let's say, think about Stalingrad and think about Bonn, right? Think about the siege of Leningrad and think about Wiesbaden. Think about partisan warfare in Belarus, and then think about nice journalists in Hamburg. You know, the images are very hard to hold together in one's mind. It's very hard to put together the nice image that we have of the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, the history of West Germany, right? If I say the history of West Germany, what do you think about? Right? The selection of associations that we have of the history of West Germany is very hard to get together with the selection of images we have with the Holocaust, starvation sieges, mass shootings in Eastern Europe. The interesting thing is that it's the same people, right? It's the same men who achieve both things. It's the same people. There are more Nazis in the German Foreign Service in the late 1940s than there were during the Second World War. Former Nazis, of course, at that point. It's the same people. It's the same history, right? And if we can establish that, then we can start to think about the relationship between an empire and a state, or what a state chooses to do. I don't say any of this to tarnish the origins of the European Union, but only to make it more realistic. What's interesting and characteristic about the Germans is not that they lost the Second World War. That's not so important. What's important is that they lost a colonial war, and they did so early, and they knew it. They knew it. As of 1939, the German idea is empire cannot be established in the broader world, but we can establish it in Europe. As of 1945, the conclusion is empire cannot be established anywhere. What shall we do? What shall we do? And the answer is, beginning in 1951, we have a nice set of economic agreements with the French, with the Italians, with the Luxembourgeois, with the Belgians, with the Dutch. We have this thing called European integration. The history of European integration is integrally linked to the history of empire. It is not so closely linked to the history of the Second World War. Okay? That's a European fable. It's what Europeans tell themselves. They say, we learned, that's a good point for me to be censored actually. We learned from the Second World War that war was a bad thing. Hence, we started this process of European integration. Okay? You must have heard this because it is the standard West European propaganda. And it is not, it has no relationship to reality at all. If Europeans learned from the Second World War that war is a bad thing, then the centers of world pacifism would be Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and Israel. Right? Because those are the Europeans who suffered the most from the Second World War. If suffering in war made you a pacifist in Europe, then these would be the centers of world pacifism. I ask not for your particular judgments about Russia, Belarus, Israel, and Ukraine, but can we agree that they are not the centers of world pacifism, right? They're not. What Europeans learned from, okay, and why is it so much fun to say, we learned from the Second World War that war was a bad thing? Because the next move you make is, and the stupid Americans didn't learn that, right? That's why it feels so good. Like many things that are completely that's why we accept things that are not true, because they feel good. So what Europeans actually learned was that losing colonial wars could not be done indefinitely. The Germans were ahead of everyone else. They lost a colonial war in a definitive way. But as other Europeans, the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, lose their colonial wars, they land in Europe. Right? Europe is the European Union, the European project, the European community, and then the European Union is the soft landing after empire. That's what it is. But you don't say that to yourself because you never tell history to yourself. What you say to yourself is the fable of the wise nation. The fable of the wise nation says, we were always a nation, then we got to the Second World War, and we learned that war was a bad thing, and so we started economic cooperation. That's the fable of the wise nation. Right? It bears no relationship to reality. And the reason why, I'm not just saying this to make me feel good and you feel bad, because it doesn't make me feel that good. I'm saying it because the important thing is that if we get this piece right, we begin to see how the European Union matters, and again, how Ukraine is hypertypical. Because if the European Union is the safe place to land after the end of empire, that gives us a different way of thinking about the West European state, which is very important, especially at this time of national populism. Because the whole premise of national populism is, hey, let's go back to the nation state. And interestingly, no one ever responds, we can't do that because we never had a nation state. Right? There are many reactions to national populism in the European Union, but as far as I know, that's not one of them. And the reason why is that all Europeans, right, left, center, whatever, are of the view that at some point back there was a nation state, but there wasn't, right? And this is relevant because it means that for example, it's very relevant to Brexit. There cannot be Brexit. If there's exit, no Britain. If there's Britain, no exit. But there won't be both. There is no reason to think that you can go back to a British state when there's never been one. There's been an empire, and then there's been a collapsing empire which was bailed out by an integration project, but there has never been a Britain as such. There's never been a France in this sense. There was a French empire which fell apart and which was rescued by a European integration project. There has never been a France in the sense of l'hexagone, right? L'hexagone is one of these evocative phrases of something which never happened. So it has major implications for how you think about populism in Western Europe. But it also has major implications for how you think about Eastern Europe. In Poland, in Hungary, in Russia, there is also this idea that perhaps the 1930s were not such a bad time. And in Eastern Europe, of course, there were nation states. They just didn't last very long. And if you look at it only from your national point of view, you don't draw a general lesson. You say, well, we didn't last very long because the outsiders were evil. Okay. But if nobody lasts for very long, it can't just be that the outsiders are evil. It has to be that there's a systemic problem. But East Europeans, by not considering this in a systemic way, are making a big mistake. But I wanted to talk about Ukraine. So the EU is a soft landing after empire in two senses. If you were a big maritime empire, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, the French, then the EU is where you land when you lose your maritime empire. If you were a Soviet periphery, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, 2013, Croatia, the last enlargement, the EU is where you go for a soft landing after empire in a different way, after leading somebody else's empire. And the very interesting thing about the European Union, I think its most interesting achievement is that it manages to bring together post-imperial states of both kinds. And in that sense, the European Union is not really a settlement to the Second World War. The European Union is a settlement to the First World War, if anything. Because what the European Union does is it brings together the doomed nation states created after the First World War with the places that were still maritime empires after the First World War. In other words, if we look back 100 years from today, if we consider the European Union from the point of view of 1917 or really 1918, what it has done is it has brought together the doomed nation states of Eastern Europe with the places that back then were still empires and seemed like they would always be empires. That's its historical achievement. It's the peace settlement of the First World War. That's what the European Union is. Which slowly brings me to Ukraine and how Ukraine is hypertypical. If it is correct that the purpose of the European Union is the rescue of the European state, then the protests on the Maidan make perfect sense. Because the logic of the protests on the Maidan was something like, Ukraine has a problem with the rule of law, that is, the essential problem of state building. It could use a little help from the outside, or more than a little. We're hopeful that the association agreement with the European Union will be a push in the right direction, which it would have been, and probably still will be. Now, that, if you're a Ukrainian, I can juggle them if you want. If you're a Ukrainian revolutionary, your situation seems specific, and understandably, I understand that. But it's part of a more general political trend. The European Union rescued all of these states. After it rescued them, the nations take it for granted, and they keep telling themselves the fable of the wise nation. The fable of the wise nation is that the nation was always there and it made good choices. Any story about how something is always there and made good choices should be suspicious, by the way. But I'm talking about relationships, but you don't have to laugh at the joke. Thank you for bailing me out, Wolfgang Muller. The point is that Ukraine is a specific example, maybe an extreme one, but of a general situation. The EU also bailed out the French state. It also bailed out the German state. That's what it did. It made the European state possible. So if the Ukrainians on the Maidan seemed like they were doing something exotic by campaigning for the rule of law, that is only because the rest of us had forgotten the entire point of the European integration process, which I'm afraid is what happened. So you see where this argument is going. Ukraine in 2014 is also hypertypical. Because Ukraine faced greater costs or did more things for the same basic gains that everyone else was getting, namely the rescue of the state. So I'll just say one word in conclusion, and then we can talk. I said that I'd talk about revolutionary history and commemorative history and just history. So the argument in this talk has been not about commemoration, right? I'm going to try very hard in this year never to talk about commemoration, because I think it does bad things to us when we talk about commemoration, unless it's with art, in which case it's fine. It's not a work about how history is a science that can be accelerated, right? That's not what I'm talking about either. I'm talking about history as a kind of horizontal process in which there are connections that we see if we look horizontally, if we look to the side, rather than just looking down a national narrative. I'm talking about how global history only makes sense if we're able to look both at Europe and beyond Europe at the same time, and that the convenient division between Europe and beyond Europe actually prevents us from seeing the things that are essential to Europe itself, I think to Europe's great peril at this particular moment. And my point is that Ukraine in particular is the place which allows us, if we look at it closely, because it's so typical, because it's so intensely typical, is the place that allows us to see the general phenomenon, whether it's nations or empires, whether it's the creation of new empires in Europe, or whether it's the European rescue of the nation state. That's been my case. Thank you for listening to it.
So if anyone has questions, raise your hand and I can pass the mic.
If you could just say your name.
My name is Artem. I'm a visiting fellow at IWM, and I'm also a Ukrainian. So I'd like to ask you a question about in what sense you understand Ukraine, modern Ukraine as a nation state. Is it enough to say Ukraine is not Russia? Is it enough to say Ukraine is Europe? And to conclude that Ukraine is a national state according to notion you use, nation state. Thank you very much.
Well, I guess one of the points I was trying to make is that the discourse of the nation is radically different from the reality of the state. So when the state is achieved, a discourse of the nation appears, which is radically at odds of the actual history of the nation. This is something that I'm just convinced of. The European Union is just an example of that. When the European Union rescues the European states, it also rescues the myth of the nation. The only reason why Portuguese and Polish school children and Estonian and Greek school children and even German and French school children can learn national history in state schools is because Europe rescued their states, you see? And so the fables that we're able to tell ourselves go almost 180 degrees against reality. They don't acknowledge their own necessary conditions. So if you're asking me why, at what point I would say that Ukraine is a state, I was using nation state to kind of let me go back and forth between stories of the nation and the political reality of the state. I wasn't trying to say that only ethnicities can make a state or anything like that. If you're asking me under what conditions Ukraine would be a state, the historical evidence is very strong, I think, that the European state depends upon some larger level of politics in practice, not de jure, right, but de facto. That of course, Ukraine was a state before Russia invaded it, but the Russian invasion is harder to conceive of had Ukraine at that time been in some larger European unit of politics. There's a reason why it's hard to think of war between Germany and France now, even though for the previous 600 years it had been totally normal. So de facto, I think the way that European states achieve statehood is by performing a kind of trick where they give up sovereignty and get a lot more back, right? There's a magic trick with pooling of sovereignty. So what Europeans complain about is, we gave up sovereignty and now we have less. That's what everyone says. And it's interesting how similar that is to the period of Glasnost. Like when Gorbachev made this mistake that communists always make when they try to reform and they allow free speech. With Glasnost, everybody in the Soviet Union used Glasnost to say, we've got a secret that we just have to share, and that is that we on the periphery were exploited the whole time by the center. Right? Everybody said that, including the Russians. Everybody always is of the view that your part is exploited by the center. It's just a kind of historical rhyme. But now in the European Union, everyone is of the view that, well, yes, of course we're giving more than we get. And everyone is wrong. Literally everyone is wrong, because what everyone is getting is sovereignty. So you may be giving more money or less money or a little sovereignty or more, but what you're getting is the state. And that goes totally unacknowledged. So anyway, the way I think of the Ukrainian state is that a European state needs a higher level of politics. In that sense, I think certain Ukrainians figured this out, and I'm trying to learn from them rather than the other way around. I can't define an abstract condition like not Russia or Europe, right? Because it's a historical process. So that's Konstantin's question.
My name is Konstantin Akinsha. I was fascinated with your theory of this failing national state and interwar Europe as a cemetery of national states. But in this last national state, which is the national state of Finland,
that's the best.
Despite of all obstacles, attempt of communist coup after the war.
Yeah.
It's what is this? Is it an
Yeah, I'm happy when the conversation goes to Finland because because I think you're right. I think it's an exception. I think it's an anomaly. I mean, there are other ones like Iceland. You know, there are exceptions to this. But the core of my argument is that almost all of the new nation states fail, which is it's a pretty interesting general rule that we don't notice because of the national history. There's a particular Lithuanian tragedy or Polish tragedy or what have you, but we don't usually say, the Western peace settlement was to establish nation states, and every single new nation state that we helped to establish was killed within 2 decades. That's, we don't like to think of it that way, but that's what happened. But there are exceptions. I take your point. And the second part of my claim is that all of the major maritime empires then joined the European Union, which I also think is interesting. I mean, isn't it interesting that, there are various kinds of arguments about that at the time, but they all did it. And I also find it interesting that Britain can only leave, but which I don't think is going to happen, by the way, but Britain can only consider leaving after it no longer remembers what it was to be an empire. When you're losing the empire, you know perfectly well that you need a huge trade zone, right? Because you're used to having one. Once you've been in the interesting thing about the European Union is that it motivates our strongest human capacity, which is the capacity to take things for granted. Yeah.
My name is Annika Weidmann. I work for the European Union. Not anymore on Eastern Europe or Western Balkans or anything. I'm working on Iran, which is bad enough. But assuming I would go back to Eastern Europe and maybe Ukraine. Now your theory that you displayed basically that the state cannot be a state without the overarching umbrella somehow. I think that is an interesting point and might be true. I have to think about it more. And maybe the Ukrainians in 2004 and 2014 felt this. And that's why they demonstrated to be closely associated or be a member of the EU. However, the EU didn't really react in the way they maybe should have reacted. So in a situation where there is no willingness on the EU side to invite them and allow them to be a sovereign state inside the European Union, in such a situation where we have on the to the east of Ukraine a country that has a different agenda. Now, what is your advice for us, for the EU?
I mean, you're coming awfully fast from, you're saying, okay, you have this historical analysis, now solve the world's problems. Whereas, right. Whereas, I'll comment on that, but I want to say that much as it's enjoyable to comment on contemporary things, I think it's really important to actually have a kind of orderly notion of the past, right? Because, let's say that I'm actually correct. And I think, these are, in a way, these are just simple empirical claims. The interwar nation states didn't make it. The maritime empires, when they lost their maritime empires, joined Europe, right? I'm telling the story in a very different way, but the empirical claims are not really controversial. When I give this talk just to West Europeans, and I say the thing about how you never had a nation state, I always give them 15 seconds to think about it. Like I just stop, because that's how long it takes to realize, oh, yeah, I actually never had a nation state. But it's interesting that that West Europeans think that they did until you actually confront the proposition directly. I did this in London, and I did the 15 seconds, and they were like, oh yeah, right, because they never did, but they all think that they did, and that I'm trying to say, like that itself has political significance, and I think the most that historians can really do, or artists actually, or all of us who are trying to like show things. To pursue truth, I'll say it naively, the thing that we can sometimes do is make certain political mistakes less likely. So you say, Europe didn't react to Ukraine the way that it should have. I personally think that if Europeans had a different understanding of how the European Union came about, they would have been more sympathetic. And that's as far as I can. That's probably more helpful, and that's as far as I can really go, because the way that the Europeans reacted to Ukraine displayed no understanding, I think, of how their own union came about. Right? The European Union has a way of consuming its own history. It has a way of only thinking about the future, of telling a certain story. And then the nations, the member states, are all locked into national histories, right? There isn't there isn't really European history. It's not taught in schools, right? I mean, in America, European history is a legend, like, because it's the thing that American historians, I'm being recorded, can't do. Sorry. So like for us, like European history is this thing, it's this challenge. You know, Americans have this chip on their shoulders about Europe. We've got to learn the French and figure out the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and the Italian. But in Europe, there's no such thing. You're not taught European history in schools, really. I mean, or not that well. It's different from country to country. Poland's actually better than a lot of countries. But, and then, you know, which European historians write like simple, accessible histories of Europe? You know, there aren't really that many of them. Yeah, it's another one, like you can think for 15 seconds, there just aren't that many. So there isn't European history in that sense. It's that there's this story of the future of ever closer union, and then there are these fables of the past, which are basically incoherent. And then there's this missing ground, and my modest claim is that if more of that missing ground were full, then some of the politics would take care of itself. But okay, I will say this about the European Union, which is that I think the European Union either goes forward or it disappears. The logic of the European Union is the logic of rescuing states. Once it stops rescuing states, it will also stop rescuing the states that are its members, right? It either goes forward or it doesn't exist.
Dardis McNamee, Metropole. I learned something very important from you in your earlier book about the Red Prince, the Königin von Ungarn, because there you spell out the detailed planning that the Habsburgs made in the years approaching the end of World War I, where they had a system of little kingdoms that they were going to set up as subsets of the empire, of the Habsburg Empire, and that would have been a confederation of some sort, formed to be decided along the lines of Hungary maybe, or related. And in parallel to that, you sort of have Churchill's comments in his memoirs about how the taking apart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was the cardinal tragedy at the end of World War I. I'm just interested, and then just one small tidbit, which was that Otto Habsburg on his 95th birthday told an assembled group in Vienna, when he was asked about how he felt about the expansion of the EU, he said, well, that's what we had in mind all along. And with all those things in mind, what the parallels that you must understand much better than the rest of us between that plan that they had and what we now have, and what implications there may be for how we should understand the problems we're going to be facing in view of that history?
I'll say two. I don't want to get down into the details of Archduke Karl Stephan and how he was raising his children to be members of different nations. Although it is fascinating. But it's an example of the interesting proposition that empire and nation can go together. And when I look at the work of my Habsburg colleagues, right, whether it's the brilliant Peter Judson's recent Synthetic History of the Habsburg Monarchy, which summarizes the work of people like Terazara and Ben Fromer and Eagle Glassheim, Jeremy King, a bunch of other great historians of the Habsburgs in the post-Habsburg period, the whole way that the field has tilted has been to say that the Habsburg Empire was actually pretty functional by the standards of its time and doing a pretty good job with the national question before the Great War. That's the way that the field has basically gone. As the historians of the field, I think, have gotten more sophisticated. And I find that really interesting because the lesson that many of us in the West drew from the First World War was something like nations and empires can't go together, and that the British and the Americans and the French were doing something liberatory by wiping the Habsburg monarchy off the face of the earth because it was a prison house of nations. And of course things were going to go better after that. And then we don't really come to grips with, some of the consequences of that. We don't like to think, well, okay, we had Wilson and self-determination, and then none of those states survived for more than 2 decades. And they were all either destroyed or they became Nazi allies, or they became Nazi allies and then Soviet satellites within a few years. we don't face it that way, right? Oh, the Cold War is a bad thing, the Soviet Union is a bad thing, the Nazis are bad. But we don't think, well, our creations, collapsed amidst that. We don't tell the story that way. And so it's not that, I don't want to make this opposition between like bad France and America and the good Habsburg monarchy, but I do think there's something like a Republican paradigm. I don't mean Republicans are a political party. I mean like Republican in the sense of republics, where the French and the Americans, considering themselves as republics, as secular, as modern, define the Habsburgs as being backwards and doomed to die, right? So the war was just destiny. It wasn't action by people or by us. It was just destiny. And yet, when Wilson gave his famous speech about the 14 points, as you'll probably know or be able to deduce, there were, obviously there were no women, but there were no blacks. We had already, like the Jim Crow and Jim Crow had already proceeded so far, and the southern states had already cooked their electoral processes to such an extent that there were no blacks in the U.S. House of Representatives. And yet there we were saying that the Habsburgs were so discriminatory to their nationalities, right? So there is something strange about the way we've received the First World War. And it's almost as though in order to justify ourselves, we have to say empires and nations can't go together. And then we forget all the interesting ways that the Habsburgs were trying to make them good. The way you mentioned is one, but there were others. There were all kinds of legal reforms. There were all kinds of efforts at cultural toleration. Much of the Austrian left, Renner and Bauer, were thinking about ways to have some kind of nationally just empire. So that whole tradition was was cast away. Now, it's not just like the EU. Of course, Otto von Habsburg is exaggerating a little bit, but there is something about the need for two levels of politics, where what happens, some things happen in one place and some things happen in another place, and how that's strengthening rather than weakening. You can see that as a kind of lesson of the Habsburg monarchy, which again, by world standards in 1914, was a pretty wealthy country with export-led economic growth, and where national toleration, although always a problem, was rather increasing than decreasing.
Eugen Spanok is my name. A puzzlestone I missed in your lecture now. What is the position of Russia in your system? Is it still an empire in collapse, already a nation state, which is also doomed? And why did they invade Ukraine after this independence trial?
Yeah. No, that's a really good question, because on my own premises, no one is outside the argument, right? Everyone has to be inside the argument in one form or another. So I take it the question is about, you're talking about the contemporary Russian Federation. Yeah. So the contemporary Russian Federation is, I think, the state whose actions make all of this clearer. I mean, you can, my brief was to talk about Ukraine, but one could give a very similar lecture about Russia, where instead of protests on the Maidan, you would end up by talking about the formulation of Eurasia as a policy in 2000, especially in 2013, where what the Eurasian policy reveals, I think, is that the leaders of the Russian Federation had understood uniquely that they were a former empire which was not going to find a soft landing in Europe. Now we can debate about whose fault that is, right? We can say the Europeans could have been more sophisticated in how they approached Moscow. We can say that the Russians should have been more realistic about what integration means. As I see it, in different ways, Putin and Yanukovych had this period in their careers where for years they told themselves you could have it both ways. You could both be a kind of oligarchical clan leader and you could move your country to Europe. There's a very interesting editorial that Putin wrote, I think it was for Die Welt, a German newspaper in 2010, where he basically says that. He says, let's have it both ways. We can't quite make Russia like Europe the way that you expect, but on the other hand, we're a really important country. So why don't we just integrate without Russia doing any of the things that are necessary to integrate? He put it in a slightly different way, but that was the idea, right? And that's in a way, like that's the kind of turning point. Because if we think about the scheme in terms of Russia, Russia is the only is the first European post-imperial state to actively reject Europe as a soft landing. That's what's, for me, that's what's historically interesting about the current Putin presidency, is that there were 3 important articles that Mr. Putin wrote, one in late 2011 and then 2 in early 2012, where he actually sketches this out explicitly, where he says that we no longer think that Europe is a goal. We're not going to try to reform ourselves according to European models. We're going to redefine integration not as the rule of law, but integration as civilization. This is the same time that he starts talking about Russia as a civilization state. And what's meant by civilization is not achievement, not meeting the standards of the European Union, but just it's not doing anymore, it's being. It's a kind of ineffable notion of Russian virtue, which in practice, means heterosexuality or something. But the idea is that we're not going to do things because integration isn't about achievement. Integration is about virtue. And he says this very explicitly. And then, interestingly, at the end of the 3rd article, he ends the 3rd article with this war cry about Ukraine, where he says, and not everyone understands that Ukraine is part of the same civilization that I'm talking about. And anyone who doesn't understand that, let them know that we will never be separated, Ukraine and Russia. Which I thought was pretty interesting at the time, and I think turned out to be pretty important. So the way to understand, as I see it, Russia, Ukraine, and Europe is to understand Russia and Europe. The war in Ukraine is just a part of a larger anti-European turn, because, and this is all very logical, if you're Moscow and you've drawn the conclusion that you can't join Europe, then it follows immediately from that. It's the next heartbeat, that Europe can't be allowed to exist in its present form. If Europe rescues other nation states so that they are richer and freer than your state, that cannot be allowed to continue. So the moment that you realize Europe, see, it's the same thing I said in response to the question about Ukraine. The moment that you realize you can't join Europe is also the moment that you have to do away with Europe. And so it's not, as the Russians used to say, it's no accident that that you then get in 2013 the turn against Europe, where Europe is defined as decadent. The conference organized by Malofeev, where the Front National comes and they say the problem with Europe is its decadence, its homosexuality. Everything is redefined in terms of values rather than in terms of achievement. And then, likewise, again, going back to, when you see Russia going into Ukraine, or when you follow the Russian media coverage of the Maidan, which I did quite closely, the way that what they did with the Maidan was that they said this is an example of Western decadence. On the first day of the Maidan, when there were only students protesting, on the first day, day 1 of Russian media coverage, talked about a homosexual crisis in Ukraine. Day 1, right? It was just students on the street at that point. They were already talking about a homosexual crisis in Ukraine, and it just goes on like that through November and December. It gets more colorful as they have more time to think of stuff. But Ukraine is phrased in these civilizational terms. And the civilizational terms are fundamentally about how the European Union has no right to exist. So for me, it's all one story. And so when I say that what's interesting about Ukrainians is in the protesters on the Maidan understood history in roughly the same way that I do, you see that's also true about Russians in the Kremlin. They also understand history more or less the same way I do. They're just in a very different position, and they have different instruments of power, and they're deploying them in these ways, right? They understand that Europe either rescues states or it doesn't exist at all. They understand that. I think that's axiomatic to them. If Europe not rescuing Ukraine is the same thing as Europe not existing. And the policy against Ukraine is the same as the policy against Europe. It's all one thing.
Oleg Hilnitsky. I'm not a historian. I'm a literary scholar.
That's very modest, Professor Hilnitsky.
My question is this: you mentioned that for a state to survive, it needs a higher level of politics, and I grasp that. I understand that as far as Eastern Europe is concerned, as far as Ukraine is concerned. But I'm wondering, certainly Britain and France had a high level of politics. Could they not have survived states without being rescued by Europe, by the EU idea?
But the important thing in your question has already been answered by your question, which is that you've shifted to a counterfactual, which for me is the important thing, right? So we've already agreed that that's not what happened. And that is a huge advance over the consensus understanding of European history. The consensus understanding of European history is what I call the fable of the wise nation, where there really were nations and they made choices. I'm sorry I'm belaboring your question. I know you understand your own question. I'm just trying to suggest why it's important. What you're saying is maybe they could have, right? It's a conditional, it's a counterfactual. And so my answer is going to be extremely conservative, right? Because actually my whole argument has been very, very conservative. It's tried to stay very close to the ground of what the facts actually are, as opposed to the narrative gravitation which makes them otherwise than they seem. And the facts as they are that the thing called France and the thing called Britain did survive inside the European Union, right? And so therefore for me, I'm not going to answer your question definitively, but therefore for me, the burden, I'll just put it this way, the burden of proof was upon those who would like to show that Britain and France could survive without some higher level of politics. And if we can go that far, going back to your question about what Europeans should do today, that makes the whole Brexit debate totally, or would have made the whole Brexit debate totally different. Because the people who are arguing for Brexit did not feel that the burden exist as a state. Nobody felt that way. Everyone on both sides of the argument assumed that it's going to exist as a nation state. But I think, once we see history correctly, then the burden of proof is on you to show that you could do it without everyone else. And I mean, that's a useful, I think, word of caution also, if you're Warsaw or Budapest, and you think that there's no way that the European Union can leave you, which I think is not true at all. Okay.
So as master of the clock and holder of the microphone, I am going to jump in. My name is Kate Younger. I'm the research associate with the Ukrainian European Dialogue program here. And I'd like to thank Tim for his talk tonight, for a bit of entertainment and also enlightening insight. Thank you. Thank you, Tim. We're going to shift gears ever so slightly to the artistic aspect of our program. And before I hand the microphone over to Dr. Akinsha, I'd just like to say that you should have on your seat a little flyer that lists the film screenings that are going to be taking place on Sunday and then again on Wednesday. You are very, very warmly welcome to join us for those. It's going to be a great program. On Wednesday in particular, these are films that have never been screened in Austria before, and so we'd be very excited to have you join us for those. The last thing I would like to say is that if Konstantin's brief talk now whets your appetite for more, on Monday, Ivan Kozlenko will be giving a seminar at 4 p.m. here in the library on a similar subject, and it's a great opportunity to hear from the director of the Dovzhenko Center, who we're really honored to have here, so thank you. And now I will pass it over to Konstantin.
Thank you.
Oh, he says Tim's microphone. This one.
In difference to Professor Snyder, I have very, very short time, and I just want to introduce our project. In a sense, few years ago, I could say that Ukraine, it's a country without history. Now it's a country with history, but still a country without art history. There are reasons for this. We are starting to research the history of Ukrainian avant-garde, Ukrainian modernism, Ukrainian art of the first half of the 20th century only during last years. It's very understandable because in difference to Russia, we lost probably 40, 50 years of research of the modernist tradition. Because Ukrainian modernism was facing two burdens. During the Soviet Union, it was treated as formalism, but Russian avant-garde was treated as formalism too. However, since the 60s, in Russia, researchers were finding tricks and excuses talking about artists devoted to the revolution and tried to partly rehabilitate some of them. In Ukraine, unfortunately, this burden had another side. They were not only formalists, they were treated as bourgeois nationalists. Because of this, research of Ukrainian art tradition of the 20s and 30s started basically only after the independence. And our knowledge still is very, very limited. We try to make a little exhibition. It's probably, let's say, the first project of this type on Ukrainian film poster. If Russian film poster of the same period is perfectly known, collected, sold, bought, represented in the biggest museum of Europe, Ukrainian film posters is by today Film Center succeeded to publish the first and the only book on Ukrainian film poster of the period. Many of these artists are not known to you. They were not even known to me, despite I am dealing with art history for quite a long time, and especially focused on Ukrainian art history. In some cases, we don't know even the first names of the artists. We know, like for example, Finagenov, we know his initial A, and there is no one document so far found mentioning his first name. It's a very interesting material because it's a really developed culture of graphic design, especially developed during late 1920s and during 1930, because after this, it's basically interrupted. Like Ukrainian film culture in general, of course, it's provoking one question and provoking very often fierce debates. For example, in the film presentation which we are organizing in the Belvedere 21 House, we are showing films by Dziga Vertov and Kaufman. And of course, our Russian colleagues will say, no, 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 no. It's not Ukrainian avant-garde, it's Russian avant-garde. However, talking about Dziga Vertov, who was born not in Russia, not in Ukraine, let's say in the Grand Duchy of Poland, it's very difficult to find these labels. And plus to this, he was a real avant-garde film director and quite internationalist. But why we counting this as Ukrainian film culture? These people came to Kyiv in 28, 29, 1930, practically in the same very time when Kazimir Malevich found refuge in the Kyiv Art Institute, when Vladimir Tatlin had to go to Ukraine to teach in the same art institute only because of one reason. Censorship in Ukraine was much softer than in Russian Federation. What was possible in Kyiv was already impossible in Moscow or Leningrad. So Ukraine is becoming the last refuge for avant-garde, alas, for very, very short time. This time was limited basically by 3 years because after 1960, repressions begin and Ukrainian avant-garde culture was basically destroyed with severity, which was not even typical for repressions in Russia, because martyrology of Ukrainian art is basically endless. Quantities of artists, poets, film directors who were basically shot during the repressions is stunning. So what we're introducing to you with film poster is the first teaser. I really hope that research will be continued. I really hope that documents will be found. And the practice of Dovzhenko Art Center is proving unbelievable surprises, unbelievable discoveries are possible even today. I don't want to mention the famous quote from Bulgakov, which became quite stereotypical by it now. The manuscripts don't burn. We know that manuscripts burn, and burn very well. But sometimes surprises are waiting for us. For example, Dovzhenko Film Center succeeded to find, and we have to be grateful to Ivan Dovzhenko, who was leading this operation, the disappeared film. The campaign for more than 50 years was counted as a lost film. Nobody believes that it exists. We knew only few film stills which were published in newspapers. But the materials were found in Ukrainian archives. The film was restored. This year was the premiere of this film in London. And next week it will be shown for the first time in Austria, which will be continental premiere of the film of Kaufman, which was counted disappeared. So we still have hope that something could be possible to find. I want to repeat that it's a very, very long road, and many, many things have to be done. Enjoy the exhibition. Look at the posters. Some of these artists are artists of high international quality, like, for example, Ibrahim Lipnitsky. There are artists with unbelievable personal stories. It's very interesting material, but again, it's the first effort to make these materials public, and long, long work is awaiting for us. Thank you very much.
The big screen in the meeting room, which is next door, and you're also very warmly welcome to go up and down the stairs and look at them. And there's wine and cheese in the cafeteria downstairs.
And I wanted to add, of course, we could not show real posters in this building. We have reproductions, but we try to make them as realistic as possible.